Chairman, we are live.
Great, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. The South Florida Water Management District's Governing Board is pleased to present today's Lunch and Learn that's going to provide an overview of the flood and sea level rise and resiliency plan. The water management system operated by the district is impacted by changes in sea level rise and climate change effects, including changing rainfall and flood patterns. To continue mission critical functions, the district is taking steps to ensure the water management is more resilient in light of climate changes and sea level rise. Today's meeting is intended to inform both the board and the public on key parts of the district's resiliency strategy, and the board will not be taking any action or votes today. Public comment is going to be taken during the public comment part of today's agenda, which is item number 7. And staff will call on your name to speak. If you're participating via phone, *6 mutes and unmutes, and *9 raises your hand. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that Lunch and Learn sessions have a 1 o'clock hard stop. And we'll kick off the workshop by calling on Dr. Thomas Fraser, who's a Dean of College and Marine Sciences at the University of South Florida. I'd like to welcome Dr. Fraser for welcoming remarks, and thanks very much for being with us today.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me join your meeting. I'm very fortunate to be able to spend the day with Dr. Moran and members of her team to understand better what activities are going on here in the district with regard to resilience planning and other related things. And so I have the opportunity, as many of you know, of trying to stand up the Florida Flood Hub for research, application, and innovation that was part of some legislation this year, Senate Bill 154, and a Resilient Florida. So again, I recognize there's a tremendous amount of capacity here in the district, both technical and scientific. And so I'm just trying to capture some of that moving forward. And hopefully I'll be able to contribute to this discussion or future conversations with this group. So again, just thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us, Dr. Fraser. I'd now like to call on Dr. Carolina Moran, who's the District Resiliency Officer, and I'd like you to introduce the District's Resiliency Initiatives. Thanks, Dr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. We haven't had lunch yet, so I'm still in the good morning mode. So thank you for the opportunity to present this Lunch and Learn today and to talk about our resiliency initiatives. I know you have been exposed to this slide in the past. It really shows the system, our Central and Southern Florida project system, the concept that we have. And for the discussions that we are here today to talk about, to focus in, and I'm talking about sea level rise and flood resiliency, I think it's really important just to emphasize that the system was designed and constructed about 7 years ago for conditions such as 2 million people. We are now 8, 9, and much less urban development than what we have today in South Florida. So I think those are just some important highlights. And in addition to that, to land and urban development and population increase, the system is also being, I would say, challenged by those climate change observations and projections. So we have been documenting this steady sea level rise trend here in our coast. We have higher groundwater levels, which also represents loss of soil storage, especially during the wet season. So also part of the goals of achieving flood protection. And also we have been seeing more extreme rainfall events and some upward trends in some of the regions here in South Florida. And we had the chance to go today to visit one of our coastal structures during high tide season. And I think we have an interesting video that we put together this week to really show some of the existing current limitations already imposing restriction in our system operations. So we have been monitoring king tide events, especially during the king tide season, using some technology, some drones too. And in fact, today is one of those days, one of the days where we have predicted high tides. We visited the structure earlier today, and that's what you are seeing there. So really rising tidal elevations. We have a quick video here showing the levels rising in the morning and then receding a little bit later in the day, but really pointing to the fact, and we're going to see in a second, that those elevations in the ocean side are really getting close to the top of our gates. You can see that, like really limiting our discharge capacity, really reducing the head that we have inland versus downstream, like that really is the basis for the operation of our system. We have a quick animation here that also shows this, like we need the head, we need the inland side to be a little bit higher, significantly higher than the ocean side. So we have this discharge capacity. And when the ocean side is higher, what happens is that our capacity to discharge is limited and you can result in flooding. And here is what we already seen. So this is actually saltwater overtopping a gate. This is S25 in the king tide season 2 years ago. So the top of the gate here is really below the high water, the tide levels here during this day. So we are really seeing that the limitations in our operation are already happening. And it's evident then that we have an urgency to address the vulnerability of our system, the CNSF, and we also have to remember we have the Big Cypress in the West Coast there. So really need to address our flood protection system. We are working with partner agencies to identify those priority projects, really coordinating with our internal teams and with partner agencies to identify what are those priority projects and how they work together, combined, and really pursuing, really identifying funds that we can use to accelerate the implementation of those urgent actions, and really working through local and regional partnerships. So we know the solutions are not going to come just from one agency. We really need to be able to understand what the agencies are planning and doing and how they are looking at flood protection. So earlier this year, our governor executed Senate Bill 1954. Dean Fraser mentioned it a few minutes ago. And it was the historic and largest Florida flooding and sea level rise resiliency initiative that we have in the state, making available over 640 million to support those efforts, to really ensure that our state and local communities are prepared to deal with the impacts of sea level rise, intensifying storms and flooding. And in order to provide, I would say, a robust response to this opportunity, our team worked quickly. I would say we had 3-4 months to work on this, on our initial flooding and sea level rise plan. And our vision is really to, of course, first and overall, provide reduction in the risks, effectiveness in the work we are planning. We also understand that we have some technical resources, and we are identifying what we need to do and how to pursue the resources to get it done. We are also looking at anticipated future conditions. So not looking at what the conditions we have now, but really important to understand how those trends will be evolving in the future and what's being projected to occur. We are looking at population and critical infrastructure impacted by those flood risks, public engagement, and today we have a new important achievement. We are really advancing one more step in this process to bring this plan to you today, and really hope to have participation from our partners and the community in general. So we are leveraging partnerships. We are talking to the agencies that also look at that, local governments, and we are really focusing on finding innovative green natural-based solutions as part of this. One thing that it's very important to say, and is that this plan, the way it was set up for the first time and the information that we have, is founded on a solid flood vulnerability assessment that has been developed as part of our flood protection level of service program. This program has been evolving in the past 7 to 8 years, and it really works in conjunction with flood mitigation and adaptation planning, and is utilizing, I would say, the most advanced models that is capable of representing those risks, the associated drainage infrastructure that we have, and really representing how we want to look at flood risks now and into the future. The plan served really to support and direct our initiatives, so we were able to obtain best available information from those assessments and those adaptation planning efforts to this first round of the document. And this is being used to all our grant applications, fund alternatives, and also informing our capital improvement projects and our pursuit of dedicated funds through state and federal appropriations. Here is one slide that has a lot of information, but the overall goal is just to tell you that since a little bit earlier than 2017, we initiated those assessments. So the top boxes, the green boxes there, are really the results of each of the assessments that were completed in the basins in South Florida. We initiated with mostly Broward and Miami-Dade County basins, and we are moving a little bit north now, hoping that we initiate the FPLOS effort in Palm Beach this year, and also looking at Kissimmee Basin. We also have, so those, the boxes on the top represent those basin-wide assessments. We also did 2 assessments. Those are the green boxes in the middle that look at the critical structures, like really the focusing on our low-lying coastal structures and what needs to be done in conjunction with those basin-wide assessments. And I would say the year 1 plan that we have today is focusing more on those coastal structures in those needs that are the urgent needs that we need to begin addressing those risks. And it's really important that we continue to collaborate and inform with the FPLOS program year after year during this plan formulation, so we can bring also project needs that are going to be representing basin-wide needs and all this integrated strategy. So with that, I think I have the opportunity to ask Akin to join us. I'm really digging some of the details of our flood protection level of service program.
Great. Akin Owasina, who's our Bureau Chief for Hydrology and Hydraulics, you're going to talk about our flood protection level of service.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Today, I'll be giving you an overview of the flood protection level of service program. And the focus of my talk today will be on how that program evaluates the flood risk across the district and how it identifies projects that make it into the resiliency plan. I'll do a little bit of the history, how the program came about, and essentially how it's implemented. But before I talk about the flood protection level of service program, I need to describe a critical aspect of flood protection in South Florida. The flood protection system in South Florida is made out of, comprises of 3 tiers. There's the primary system, the secondary, and the tertiary system. And as an analogy from transportation, you can think about the primary system like the freeways, which are the main trunks that discharges or moves large volumes. You can think about the secondary system like the arterials that gather flows from the tertiary systems, which would be equivalent to the collector or local roads. With regards to flood protection, the primary system is operated by the district, our organization, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It often would discharge to tide. The secondary system flows into the primary system, but gathers stormwater from the tertiary system, which is operated by homeowners, homeowner associations, and large landowners. The secondary system is operated by local government and 298 districts. So a little bit now about the history of the flood protection level of service program. For many years, the district has recognized, as Dr. Moran mentioned, that we have an aging infrastructure, fantastic flood control system, one of the best in the world, but it was designed in the 1950s and built in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And many of the assets that comprise that system are reaching end of life. They're more than 60 years old. To compound this, the assumptions, the underlying assumptions that's guided the design, a number of them have become obsolete. When the design was done, sea level rise wasn't considered the way we are looking at it today. And as Dr. Moran mentioned earlier, it was designed to serve a population of 2 million people. That was the projection of the population in South Florida. We've grown a little bit more than 2 million people now. It serves a population of about 8 million people. Importantly also, when the original work was done, some of the areas that was assumed to remain open lands or farmland that could store water to protect the urban areas have now become cities. Mirasol is an example. And some of those cities will have to be drained now. So with all of these changing assumptions, the difference is it's a wonder that the system continues to work as well as it does now. But we needed to see how vulnerable some of the assets were to sea level rise. So circa 2008, the district did a number of studies and did an initial vulnerability assessment. And the image to your right shows essentially the summary of the result of that assessment, with several of the coastal structures marked in red and orange identified as being vulnerable. We verified and continued that work later on in 2020. And we confirmed that the structures, 27 of them that are listed on this map, still remain vulnerable to sea level rise. But as the district leadership started looking at the issues around this aging infrastructure, there were a number of questions that were being asked. We were having questions like, well, are we going to have to replace these structures? And if we have to replace them, when do we have to replace them? Do we need to replace them with similar structures, in-kind structures that have the same design? Or do we have to redesign them, taking into consideration the changes in their underlying assumptions that I mentioned earlier? Where do we have to replace them? Do we place them where the existing structures are, or do we move them someplace else? And in what sequence? Which needs to go first? This was the challenge that we had back in about 2005 when my bureau, the H&H Bureau, was formed, and we were tasked with coming up with a way to systematically answer these questions for the agency. What we came up with was a flood protection level of service program. It was our best effort to use technical information and practical field information to answer the questions that were being asked by leadership. It was a systematic way of identifying and prioritizing the district's infrastructure needs for flood protection. We do this by taking a look at the full system on a basin by basin basis and trying to identify those parts of the system, the structures, canals, that are most vulnerable and most at risk from rising sea level and other flood drivers. We came up with a formal process to make decisions on retrofits and adaptation of the system. And as we adapted or recommended those changes, we took into consideration making sure we had flood resilient design and construction of what we would replace the existing assets with. The one aspect of this program that was very critical and is a key component you'll find from time to time has to do with who we coordinate with. We built this program to be fully integrated with other programs within the district, like the structural inspection program that looks at these structures actively, but also to work very closely with people who have responsibility for flood protection in the secondary and tertiary system that I described earlier. The flood protection level of service program is implemented in 3 phases. Dr. Moran mentioned the phase 1, the assessments already. This is essentially a problem finding phase, and its key focus is on identifying the areas of the system that are vulnerable and are most at risk. The second phase is phase 2. I'll spend a little bit more time describing these phases in a minute. The second phase is when we start looking for the solutions. We've coined multiple names, mitigation and adaptation planning, but the takeaway here is having identified the problems from phase 1, we look for what are the correct courses of action, what project components need to be put in place to make sure that the flood protection for the region is maintained. Phase 3 is implementation. A good plan on a shelf is not useful to anyone, and this phase is the one that helps us to get to the point where the solutions that are recommended and identified in phase 2 can actually get built. And when Dr. Moran later on talks to you about the plans, the projects that are in a resiliency plan, this is our effort to get these projects into a forum where they could be funded and ultimately implemented. So what do you see in a typical phase 1 assessment? Here's a quick summary of what you might see in a phase 1 assessment study or a vulnerability assessment for flood protection. One of the things we first start with is a compilation of the flood control assets within each of the basins we're looking at. We describe the structures, we describe their operational intent and how they're supposed to work together. It's a bit of a boring read, but for those who like stuff like that, there are 2 or 3 volumes for each basin we've worked in and have added. Then we build a hydrologic model, a robust hydraulic and hydrologic model that allows us to represent the canals, the land side, as well as the structures within each of the basins we're looking at. And we use those models to do an assessment of the current conditions. That allows us to answer the question, are the assets currently doing what they're supposed to do with regards to flood protection? When we do that, we look at different rainfall intensities from common events that you could get every year or every few years to rare events that you get only many, many years apart. What's typically called a 100-year flood is one of the scenarios we look at. We also look at storm surge. Having looked at the current condition, we look at future conditions with potential sea level rise changes. Typically, we do 3 different sea level rise conditions. We also incorporate land use changes. We do an evaluation of the full system and identify underperforming segments using the model tools and the scenarios that I described. And we work closely, as I mentioned earlier, with partners in local government responsible for the secondary and tertiary system. The focus for this phase of the work is the primary system, but we make sure that we're talking closely to our partners. And our goal is to do this assessment in perpetuity, seeing each basin at least once every 8 to 10 years, unless a major project implementation forces us to do this sooner. What follows then is a phase 2 study where we're looking at the solutions, the adaptations to the system that are necessary and the mitigation that we may need to plan and design and implement. Phase 2 studies are often focused on the full system. In fact, they always focus on the full system because the solutions to flood control issues need not just be in the primary system. And the best and optimal solution would require all 3 tiers of the flood control system working in concert. So when we do the phase 2 study, it's a public planning process that incorporates the input and potential projects from partners and other stakeholders that have flood control responsibilities within each of the watersheds we're looking at. We leverage the hydrologic models that we have built and enhance on them to be able to evaluate scenarios and alternatives that might not have been in the assessment. We include a damage assessment, which allows us to look at the cost of doing nothing, the flood damage that would occur, and the cost avoidance or the cost reduction from implementing these potential courses of action to limit flood risk. We consider the sequencing of the projects, which features need to be built first and which next to get the best outcome. And we hope to select from each of these exercises an optimal course of action that includes projects to be implemented by the agency, the district, but also by the other partners within the watershed that's been studied. The images to your right are potential examples. These are infrastructure that are considered green or environmental, things like detention basins to store some of the flood water to just take the peak off so that we can then bleed it out. And some of the others, which are the kind of examples we get from a number of our partners, are the examples below that shows a multi-use green facility. It's something that serves as a park when it's dry, but when it rains, it becomes a retention or a detention facility until it gets dry again. Projects like these are included when we're looking at examples of potential adaptations to the system. We also have more traditional projects, such as the ones that I show on this slide. To your left, you're looking at a gravity spillway, which is one of our coastal structures that is being supported by a pump station. The insert to the top right shows that pump station pumping water. But a facility like this, when you have situations such as what Dr. Moran described earlier, when you close the gravity structure because the tailwater is too high, allows you to have some positive discharge and to provide some flood relief. You could also have flip gates, which prevent backwater when you have high tailwater conditions. So when you're done with this planning, what happens next? We identify projects. They're designed to a level that would allow us to adequately cost those projects, but it's not ready yet for actual construction. We can't bid the design at this point. But it's good enough that we know exactly what we're trying to do, sufficient to bring it to you, the governing board, when the projects are being advanced for the district, or for the local governments to take it to the county commission, local government chair, or their governing agencies to advance those projects. We coordinate extensively with our partners in this phase of the work, and hopefully we'll be there to support them and them to support us when we make things like grant applications or project proposals to our governing agencies. The tools that have been created from the phase 1 and the phase 2 work are shared. They're on an outward facing archiving tool, the statewide model management system, so that it can be utilized by any of the partners and stakeholders on their projects. And we tee in the work that's been identified, especially those that are being advanced for implementation, into a subsequent assessment of the basins to make sure that those features and other features that are built by our partners continue to work to provide flood protection. The image on the statewide model management system is on there with a link to it. It's a fun thing to browse through if you have some time. So what's the key takeaway from the work we've done to date? I'm sharing these next 2 slides, which are the last 2 slides from my part of the presentation, to help set your mind on what we're seeing. The image to your left, there are 2 of them. They show the summary result of the level of service simulated in our models for a number of basins. I mentioned earlier that we look at level of service in many ways. There are 6 metrics we look at, and we combine them in some way to create this map that you're looking at. And the warm colors, the oranges and the reds, show you basins where you have a low level of service, where a small rainfall event, a 5-year storm, for example, could create some flooding in parts of this watershed. What I want you to take away from this image is that today, there are a number of basins already that are warm. They show oranges. They have 5 years or thereabout level of service. And there's some urgency to start doing work on these basins already. As we go into the future with sea level rise, there are more basins that need some intervention or adaptation. And it becomes more critical as you see the colors change from oranges to red. So key takeaway from this is it's urgent, it's important, we need to start now. And knowing that, thanks to the funding that you provided about 2 years ago, we're able to launch a couple of key studies, the results of which you will hear Dr. Moran talk about. There was a coastal resiliency study, which allowed us to look at the short to near term activities we could take at a number of our coastal structures to provide added resiliency and the ability to withstand storms better and to come back quicker after they've been impacted by storms. It could be things as simple as raising generator buildings or waterproofing controls. You'll hear a little bit more from Dr. Moran on potential projects. We also looked at all of the coastal structures, as I mentioned earlier, and we identified those that were most vulnerable. And we looked at those locations at the possibility of advancing easy to determine, low risk, what we call no regret strategies, forward pumps to accompany those gravity structures to provide at least some storm relief during periods when the structures are closed. So what we've done essentially is we've leveraged all the work we're doing as we're doing the more robust phase 2 studies. We brought everything we know today into coming up with a list of projects that will be part of the plans that we put forward. At this point, I will turn over the presentation to the chair, and Dr. Moran will pick up from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Joaquin. So, okay, I think we have agreements here. Number one, we have very important challenges to address: flooding and sea level rise in South Florida. vulnerable areas, not only currently, but also exacerbated conditions in the future. And two, we have a very robust program led here by Akin and his team. We have Hong Ging also, a flood protection level of service program manager here. So a really robust program in place to guide our agency in really making the best decisions and best project recommendations for us to start addressing those flooding vulnerabilities. So I'm really happy to be here today to share some initial details of our plan and really start sharing what we're going to be focusing first. And we had to start at some place, and Akin already summarized the information that we had available. So we are looking first at our coastal structures resiliency. So we understand that fixing those coastal structures are the most urgent needs, which will bring benefits basin-wide by reducing those canal peaks far inland in those really reaching all the way to the most western areas. So what we did is we advanced some cost estimates based on those most vulnerable coastal structures, and we organized those estimates in immediate needs, short, intermediate, and long-term needs. The cycle here is following the 3-year cycle proposed by Senate Bill 1954 for the statewide flood and sea level rise resiliency plan. We also are looking at those structures. We look at initial recommendations for hardening those structures, which include refurbishment or replacement in some cases, along with additional forward pumps to really restore the lost design discharge capacity that we have in those locations, in those structures due to sea level rise. We are talking about substantial costs here, and I'm going to get to more details next, but we are really getting close to $2 billion in needs, just looking at those most urgent coastal structures solely. So what we needed to do was to go through a ranking exercise, which help us to prioritize and understand better, like the failure, the consequences, and the likelihood of failure. So to do this exercise, we look at all those results, mostly provided by the flood protection level of service. So where we see overbank flooding, the finished floor elevation on those coastal structures, where we have storm surge, sea level rise vulnerability, where FPLOS phase 1 already identify deficiencies, if we have any phase 2 recommendation, and if we know we have non-chronic flooding issues in those basins. So this helps us to evaluate likelihood of failure. And then for the consequence part, looking at those basins as a whole and understanding the coastal structure at the discharge point will be providing benefits to the entire basin upstream. We look at the population impacted, benefited by those projects. We look at existing adaptation action areas prioritized by the counties and local governments. We look at financially disadvantaged areas in those basins. We look at location of public water supply well fields, and we also look at the number, density of critical assets and lifeline in those basins. And to formulate the project scope, we had to also begin sizing those needs, those pumps specifically. So the first question was, how far can we go in improving pumping capacity for existing infrastructure in those critical locations? We also look at flood barriers and the structure elevation needs, the need for additional backup and redundancy for existing and new proposed infrastructure. And we look at land and real estate needs for those proposed enhancements. And we are framing this with an adaptation planning capacity where we can increase pumping size with the time through really a flexible planning approach. We have an extensive list of projects included in our plan, and I'm selecting just a few of those to share with you some details here today. And the first one I bring is S29. That's the one we watched in the video earlier today. So this specific structure is benefiting Broward and Miami-Dade counties. We have there a basin that is fully developed, primarily residential and commercial uses, but really with 450,000 people And what we are proposing here then is to, as I just shared in the previous slide, hardening the coastal structure, elevating the gates and some equipment. In this case, the equipment is all in the bridge. You can see on the picture there. So it's really laying really close to the levels there. So there is urgent need to elevate. We are proposing a forward pump, 2000 CFS power pump in this location and a backup generator. Flood barriers, really tying back to higher land around the structure. We are anticipating the real estate needs here. We have a park in this location right next to the structure. So we are lucky to have some good available space where we can seat the new infrastructure. And we are currently in design. So we are beginning design. We have conceptual design already completed, and we are moving towards the 30% design right now for this structure and looking at additional project components that might be interested to be addressed in this project. Another example is S27 coastal structure. This is in Little River, Miami-Dade County. That's another fully developed basin, 275,000 people. And again, we are doing the same type of proposal here, hardening up the coastal structure. In this case, a 1400 CFS pump and backup generator, tying back to higher land. Real estate needs, this is a more dense urban area. We don't have a park. We have some unoccupied private property sitting next to the structure. That's where we are seeking to place the new infrastructure. And we are also currently in design for that one, same stage as S29. And we have also incorporated in this project, in partnership with Miami-Dade County, an RFI to really see if we can seek some innovative approach that could be associated with what we are proposing in this plan, in this design, to really bring us associated water quality benefits in this pump. And third project that I want to share with you today is the self-preservation mode. This is a more comprehensive. We are trying to address a larger number of structure in this project, looking at more immediate needs, shorter term. And the goal here is really to start with a self-preservation lockdown so that we can increase our capacity to operate those gates during storm surge, critical storm surge events. So we had an example during Irma, Matthew, Dorian hurricanes that we had to lock out those gates open in a lot of our coastal structures very early in the process when we have those forecast conditions that we know are going to be critical, even before they are confirmed, because we have staff and we have operation limitations, we need to lock them out. Our gate really early in the process. So we are trying to see if we can increase this flexibility, the remote capacity to operate those structures, and really harden some of the components, electronic, mechanical, generator, to see really goal here is to increase operation there. Another project that we have is the Corby Levee. This is an area in Palm Beach County. We had Tropical Storm Isaac brought in really a large amount of rainfall to those areas in central Palm Beach County and really widespread flooding that occur. This is an area of critical concern because we have here excessive seepage too and slope failures, and then some pathways that really facilitate the flooding to occur in this specific location, affecting the downstream communities that sit right there. So the strategy here is to strengthen the levee to meet the current Army Corps and the district standards and to really increase the flood level of protection in this area. We already built 2.6 miles of levee east of the ITID reservoir. We are proposing to complete this entire levee project with this project here. And we have cost estimated at $9.3 million here. To really complete this entire section of the levee, which will bring additional 3 miles in this location. Another project is the South 8 Curtin Wall. This is expanding from our initial 8.5 square mile area Curtin Wall project. So this is really a comprehensive flood strategy for Miami-Dade County, building resiliency by providing flexibility in the way we manage the high water conditions at the Water Conservation Area 3A. So this project specifically is beneficial both for flood protection and also for achieving restoration goals. So we're going to be keeping the occupied areas protected against flood during this wet season especially, and really directing flows to Taylor Slough and Florida Bay more efficiently with this implementation of this project. So the future phases really now is to expand the full length needed for the seepage barrier beyond the 8.5 square mile area. And really, we have brought support here from private, local, state, and federal partners. A final example here from our implementation projects is the Everglade Mangrove Migration Assessment Pilot Study. This is called Emma in our team. It's an innovative project. So what we want to do here is it's a demonstration scale pilot project study to really address ecological vulnerabilities to sea level rise and build protection, flood protection through the use of nature solutions. So the goal is to increase coastal mangrove elevation and minimize saltwater intrusion, peat collapse, and land loss, and really increase our capacity, adaptive capacity in the Florida coastal wetlands to keep up with the sea level rise and provide, as I mentioned, the flood protection to the more occupied areas upland. And the goal of this project is to place a thin layer material that can help, and we're going to be testing this nature-based, this natural solution to really allow for the mangrove areas to expand and build some accretion. The results can be applicable and extended to areas throughout the Gulf and the Atlantic coasts of Florida. And really, the goal here is preservation, enhancement, and restoration of mangrove, other vegetative communities that will be building coastal resiliency and reducing storm surge damage to really create and really create a habitat for a large variety of fish and wildlife species. Moving towards some of our planning projects, we also have a list of planning projects included in our plan. And I would be happy to talk about those projects for hours with you today, but I will keep very, very short. So the first two requests here are for FPLOS Phase 1 and Phase 2. We have recurrent funding needs, and our goal is to be able to accelerate those assessments, Phase 1 and Phase 2, in those most urgent basins. So we already included additional funding here to support and accelerate the program implementation. And we also have additional data needs. So data is really the basis for everything that we are doing here. We are funding all the assessments, modeling, and efforts in understanding what the data is trying to tell us. And we really are focusing on bringing one project here is our metrics. We have a set of water and climate resiliency metrics that we want to be able to bring to a web tool in a real time mode, so that we can be evaluating trends and observe data as we go, as we receive the data. We have a very robust monitoring program here at the district. And by allowing this real-time analysis of data and trend, we will be able to also understand what are those, the contributions of those analysis to our assessments, specifically looking at flooding and sea level rise. We are also expanding our groundwater modeling and saltwater interfacing mapping, really enhancing to look at future conditions, even like longer term future conditions. This is another need that we have. We're going to have to bring some new modules to our mod flow to be able to do that, some enhancements to the model itself. So we are looking at enhancing and expanding the capacity here. Our third project is data monitoring needs. We identify some gaps, especially when we were looking at those metrics, the water and climate resiliency metrics. We know we have some gaps, some needs that we might need to fill here with data itself. So just bringing additional funds to our hydrometeorological monitoring program. The fourth project here is a statewide regional climate model and really focusing on rainfall projections. We have received some results. We just completed a study and we're going to be sharing with the community soon, looking at future rainfall projections, but it's still depending on available downscaling results, statistical and dynamic, but not yet with the resolution needed to capture convective rainfall occurrence in Florida. So we are proposing this level 2, step 2 effort here to build a more refined regional climate model that we can enhance those forecasting rainfall occurrence and focusing not only on wet extremes, but also on dry extremes. The next one is a flooding events mapping and database tool. We have a need to really validate. When we look at those model results, observations, we have a need to validate those inundation areas. So we are looking to build, organize, compile data in a database. We are partnering with the state to really see if we can enhance how we document, how we store, and how we can use this information to validate our models. And finally, here we have a green infrastructure and flood mitigation strategy project. We're in partnership again with Miami-Dade County. It's a 7 Little River Basin. And the goal here is to maximize green infrastructure and associated water quality benefits when we look at flood protection. So beginning first on looking at this basin and beginning on what is the maximum capacity that we can address. So what's the maximum stormwater volumes that we can address through green infrastructure and how this can be associated with traditional flood protection measures. Okay, so one important player and agency that we have in all those discussions is the Army Corps. I think Akin mentioned their role in also operating and maintaining the system. And they are advancing a lot of other assessments too, to really integrate inland and coastal flood mitigation strategies. So we are partnering with them in a series of those initiatives. And coming next, we're going to have a study focusing on flood resiliency for the CNSF system, for our central and southern Florida system. This is a very important study. And if you will remember that I mentioned 2 billion in needs only for 23 pre-identified coastal structures. And we know, and our hope is to bring those additional project recommendations from FPLOS phase 2. So we know this need is going to be even larger than that. And the importance of advancing this partnership with the Army Corps and having them also looking at that and certifying and validating our models and working in partnership with us is that will bring us opportunities for federal appropriation to accelerate those projects implementation as well. So this plan, back in March last year, our governing board approved the district being the local sponsor for this project. We are going to do this again. We talk about this. We're going to do this study because of those changing physical conditions that we extensively documented today. This is going to be conducted under a special section 216 of the Flood Control Act of 1950. This gives us an advantage because the study is authorized already under this section, so we can initiate. We work in partnership with Jacksonville office to prepare an initial appraisal report. It was approved by also the South Atlantic Division offices. And what we are proposing there is a phase approach where we look at the most urgent structures and basins in the CNSF system first, and then expand to a more comprehensive study. In 2022, this year, we got a new start for this project. So we are authorized to start the study in the president's budget. And we are really waiting for this final budget process to be approved so we can formally initiate scope negotiations and a partnership agreement with the Army Corps for this study. Okay, so I think here is our plan. We are going to be providing, we already have copies of this plan in the website, and we are going to be providing opportunities for you to provide comments. This is a continuous formulation process. According to the statute, we need to present this to FDP yearly by September 1st. Our plan, as mentioned many times, is to incorporate FPLOS Phase 2 recommendation and those local projects into this plan effort every year. Really advance our analysis by looking also at flood damage cost estimate analysis. So we are bringing this capacity to look at the projects and evaluate cost, damage cost as well. That will help us with our decision-making process. We are coordinating internally with a lot of teams. We have H&H, Keen with the modeling. We have engineering working with us on all those cost estimates and project scoping. We have O&M team also looking at how we size the pumps, how we operate the system, the resiliency team, and also our partner agencies. And we are really going to be leveraging any additional funding opportunity that we might have to be able to advance this plan implementation. So public is an important piece, an important effort of what we want to do here. We are going to have a continuous public engagement effort between now and the next plan submittal. This goes mainly through FPLOS Phase 2 studies. As we know, we are advancing right now for some basins, as Akin shared with us. And we will also be allowing for additional coordinated efforts to occur while we are formulating those plans year after year. So we will make those plans available earlier. This year, year one of the plan, we had very limited time. We were represented with this request by the state with a very short time, but in future years, our plan is to present and make this document available for comments around the summertime, so we can incorporate comments every year. And as I mentioned, we are going to be sharing this draft plan for initial comments and really sharing with you and open for your suggestions, recommendations for how we advance this and the next steps. With that, I would like to thank you for the opportunity again to be here and present this plan.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Moran. I appreciate that. At this time, we're going to move over to discussion from board members. If y'all can use the raise your hand function on Zoom, I'll be able to see you and call on you. Mr. Lipich.
Thank you very much, Chair Goss. Thank you to the presenters. First of all, it's great to hear you both speak about nature-based solutions so that we still look beautiful as we harden our shorelines and all the other things that will be necessary. I did want to ask about page 17 of Akin's presentation. There's a map that shows the different color coding for it's my 17 anyway. It's a map that shows yellow, red, and kind of a light, yes, thank you, light orange to delineate priority. So when I look at that map, I can absolutely understand why it's red in the southeast quadrant on the east side, because that area, for me anyway, resonates as like the old transverse glades where the waters of Lake Okeechobee slowly did run through those areas before we channelized them and diked them and everything else and then built cities there. But I was wondering why the upper Kissimmee is red and why that western areas west of the EAA are red. Can you talk about that, please?
Yes, I can. And thank you, Mr. Lipich. That's an excellent question. It's one we get frequently when we show this map. What this map depicts are the basins that we consider the most urgent watersheds to look at. And we combine several pieces of information to determine the urgency to do level of service in each of these basins. You're correct about the area to the south east, the Miami-Dade County area. As I mentioned earlier during my presentation, the coastal structure assessment shows that these were vulnerable. And that's the piece of information that prioritized those basins. That did the same for BCB, which also had structures that were vulnerable. The inland basins, however, were not vulnerable to sea level rise. What was driving the urgency in those areas are the additional sources of information we use. One of the big sources of information we use is areas where we are getting reports of flooding. So each time it rains heavily, or each time we have an emergency deployment, we track where the complaints are coming from, where reports of flooding are happening. And what we're beginning to see is in a number of the inland communities, what's driving the flooding is loss of pervious, a lot of imperviousness coming in as you have development. So it's actually, what you're looking at, those areas, the Upper Kissimmee is an area where there's a whole lot of development going on, and where there's, we're beginning to see more and more reports of improved or increased flooding risk. And so that's one of the areas where we're targeting to do our next study. And in the Western Basins, it's the 139 area. That's the other central one just south of the lake. It's a particularly flashy basin that has some dry periods and some wet periods when we get reports of flooding. And so our goal is to go ahead and study those areas to put or quantify the flood risk and identify the contributing sources so that we can determine what the best course of action is to address the flooding that's been observed. Does that help with your question, ma'am?
It helps a lot. That's really interesting, especially the development in the northern part of the system. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr. Butler.
Well, Ms. Thurlow-Lippish kind of got my question. She got ahead of me there. I was slide 17 asking the same thing. So we're on the same page here, Jackie.
That's good, Ben. I'm sure you have a different twist to it. So ask your question.
Well, no, I mean, it was basically why are we looking at Upper Kissimmee and C-139 basins in red? And, you know, Akeem, I kind of picked up on your explanation there. And yeah, I mean, I guess that begins to make sense. You know, that's what we're hearing on the ground. We need to look at that area. And I guess as we add more rooftops, concrete and asphalt, we lose some ability to recharge water in the local superficial aquifer, that kind of thing. So yeah, no, that's, and I guess we're also speeding water up. So I guess that not only as we look at flood resiliency, flood protection level of service up in that area, it I would imagine then that we're also concerned about water being sped up and able to move south faster. So that was, but Akeem, you covered it just right. Jackie, I can't change the question. You had the right question. Akeem had the answer.
Well, I don't mean to butt in, but I think that, you know, it was really telling when Akeem at the beginning of his presentation, I think it was Akeem, it may have been Ms. Moran, Dr. Moran, when they said that originally in the Central and South Florida project, there was the, I don't know, assumption or just understanding that a lot of the ag lands would be collecting the water, and now they're rooftops, you know.
That's
it's
right.
Like, oh gosh.
Yep. So the only other thing, Akeem, and I don't want, I'll see, we got maybe one or two other people wanting to ask questions, but not a real big thing, but if you have time, just kind of talk about, I know from the FEMA flood map side of things. And I know that there were some recent rate changes in the last year, especially, I guess, over on the coastal areas, that kind of thing. Can you or Dr. Moran talk briefly about the role that the FEMA flood maps play and what role the district plays in that and helping to set those maps?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Butler. I'll take the first part of the question and I'll let Dr. Moran wrap it up. And thanks for asking that question. It's also one of the things we run into. I described very quickly, and I went over it in a bit of a hurry, that we look at 6 metrics when we are trying to determine level of service. I described the 2 that dealt with the canal and the 2 that dealt with the structures. The 2 that I did not talk about were the ones that had to do with flooding above land. We generate a map, an aerial map, that shows overland flooding, that looks at the depth of flood inundation. We also then generate a second map that looks at the duration of flood inundation, how long an area stays flooded, because both are critical and important in a flood that's a nuisance flood or one that's a harmful, damaging flood. Anytime we show the depth of inundation, we get the question, how does this compare to a FEMA map? And I thought it would be important to kind of explain the difference. First of all, we don't do FEMA flood mapping at the South Florida Water Management District. FEMA hires consultants to do that work. We are familiar with their work, we review their work frequently, and we take input to our model from some of their models. But the analysis we do are different in a number of important areas. One, FEMA looks at the 100-year flood most of the time, severe flooding, and we're looking at small events ranging through the rare events. We're looking at actions to avoid flooding, not just to quantify the extent of flooding from a big event. And so the models we run, same level of sophistication or more sophisticated, but they have assumptions that are more challenging to implement. Specific to your question, how does the level of service program and the FEMA flood mapping work interact? I think other than sharing technical information back and forth, we make their consultants aware of the models we've done and provide the models to our stakeholders. I think that's the extent of the interaction for right now. One last piece I'll add is that for the current phase of the flood protection level of service, our focus, as I mentioned, was on the existing CNSF project on the East Coast and the existing infrastructure on the West Coast, the Collier County canals. When FEMA does its work, it looks beyond the downstream of some of those coastal structures that we have. We hope that when we do the 216 study with the Corps, that we'll be working in the same space. But I believe that our analysis will always be more expansive than what FEMA does, just because the goals of the modeling is different.
Yeah, happy to add here. Akin already provided some initial robust statements here, but I think he touched to a very important point. They do have an approach that they established in the more recent maps, the coastal zone maps, where they determine a compound flooding approach, a way that they are looking at the coastal storm, the coastal surge dominated flooding, and the rainfall, what they call riverine flooding, how they occur in combination. So they have mapping processes that are different, but they established an approach recently where they can combine those maps. In areas where you have flooding that are dominated both by storm surge and by rainfall, by riverine flooding, they have a specific approach where they account for compound flooding. I believe this is an approach that is interesting for us to explore as a keen share, and we are going to be working with the Army Corps next to see if we can bring that approach to our CNSF study, so we can look at both storm surge and the inland riverine flooding impacts. Another important aspect to mention is that FEMA is an insurance perspective effort, so it looks at current risk. It doesn't project anything into the future. So all those FEMA maps, they are only looking at current conditions, and we look at future conditions in our maps. So we are using basically the same modeling tools. I would say in many of the counties in South Florida, we are having the exact same tool as FEMA is using, but we are expanding to look at conditions into the future. So looking at sea level rise and increasing rainfall. And finally, I think one important thing to say is, even though FEMA does not look at future conditions, they give credits, they give CRS credits that translate into reduced flood insurance to communities if a community decides to look at future conditions. So what we are doing here through FPLOS is really providing the communities the opportunity to apply for those discounts. So if they really get the results from our flood assessments, looking at future conditions, they can automatically apply for CRS discounts and get reduced flood insurance costs for their communities. Even though we don't have any purpose of dealing with insurance in our efforts, I can emphasize this, and that's an important message. The results of the assessment can be used by the communities to increase flood insurance costs.
Thank you, Dr. Moran. That's no, great explanation, and that helps to get it straight in my mind. And yeah, it's good to hear. I guess Akin had kind of mentioned some of the collaboration maybe on the studies that some of the studies that we're talking about that hopefully that FEMA will be able to use and going forward. And then it's great to hear that some of the structures we're talking about that the FEMA will be looking at that level of service and hopefully incorporating that into future rate maps. Because the few articles I've read, I don't have any personal experience. The few articles I've read, there were some pretty substantial rate jumps, and kind of blamed on some sea level rise type stuff. So that's good. Hopefully that'll provide some relief there. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. Colonel Roman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank the presenters today for such an excellent, informative presentation. Akeen used the term no regret strategies. And I would like to have some clarification on the meaning of the term as you used it, because it seems quite urgent. And I'd like to know an example of no regret strategy so that I can better understand it. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Roman. I'm glad you asked for an example because that was how I was hoping to respond to that question. So when we use the term no regret strategy, what we're trying to imply is that we would like to advance a solution that we think there is very low risk that it will not be part of the eventual answer. And the typical example we use is when we do the level of service work and look at any of our coastal structure. If we have a structure such as the one that Dr. Moran showed in the video she showed this morning, where you already had water above the elevation of a closed gate, just with king tides today, you know that you're going to be doing something at that structure. Doesn't matter what else you do within the basin, storage within the basin, you're going to be making some changes to that structure. So targeting that structure as part of the solution set that we advanced right now, we consider to be a no regret strategy because we believe that irrespective of what we find in the basin when we finish the study, one of the solutions that we'll have to implement will be elevating that structure and providing some getaway capacity to at least some portion of the stormwater when it has to be closed. So I hope that example helps provide the context in which I use the term no regret strategy.
What is it no regret from? I mean, to me, that's a structure that you've identified as having problems already right now with king tides that we need to address outside of the plan. I'm just trying to wrap my head around that terminology, Akeen.
So the regret is you want to make sure that you don't regret having made the investment in a solution. For example, if we advance a particular feature and then we do the analysis and demonstrate that that feature is no longer needed, we would have taken action and expended funds that would regret having spent without completing the analysis. So the idea of identifying these pieces where we were sure that we're going to be part of the solution was so that we could advance them with very low risk that we will regret having expedited them and made the investment upfront.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Colonel Roman. I have a question, and I think this is probably for Akeen, but I'm not sure. And it has to do with your assumptions. And if I missed it, let me know. But what I'm trying to figure out is what are we building to? And in other words, how much are we assuming we're going to have sea level rise? It's clearly happening now, but are we going to be having this discussion in another 50 years if sea level rise is worse than we think it is? And along those same lines, what assumptions are we using for land use when we're looking at some of the central areas that aren't developed now? Are we assuming they're going to be developed, or are we assuming they're going to stay undeveloped in the future?
Okay. Thank you, sir. And excellent questions. And you asked two questions, but there are like 4 parts to it. So I'll try to go through all the 4 parts. I'll start with the last one, the land use. So I mentioned that we do current and future conditions. For the current, we use current land use. For the future, we work with the community that we're working in. When we're in Collier County, for example, we looked at Collier County's 2065 land use, and we implemented that land use within the model. And in areas where it shows transformation from open lands to some kind of development, we represent within the model the effect of the development. So we put in the typical type of permitting conditions, the retention on site. We represented what those future land use types would look like if they were built to the current permitting conditions. So depending on the watershed we're in, the local governments plans for future land use is what we incorporate for the future conditions. The earlier part of your question was, what assumption do we make for the amount of rise? And this is an area where I was just talking to Dean Fraser earlier today. For the level of service, we're using a slightly non-traditional approach. Instead of looking 50 years into the future and looking at the projected amount of sea level rise, what we do is we do different amounts of sea level rise, a low, a medium, and a high at each of our structures, hopefully to bound the point at which that structure will start becoming inefficient, unacceptably inefficient. And so the approach we use is to find the state of the system, the amount of rise or the difference between the head and tailwater at which our structure is inefficient enough that we would wish we had replaced it. And then we work backwards from that, factoring in how long it will take to implement a solution, maybe 8 or 10 years, whatever the correct length of time is to fix something like that, and look at what the state of the structure would have been. How much rise would you have seen? And we use that threshold to determine when action must be taken. So by taking that approach, we remove some of the uncertainty around the rate of rise or the amount of sea level rise we might see at some point in the future, and identify the amount of rise you must have to make that straight. I'm trying to avoid the word fail, but I'm going to use it to make that structure fail to meet its intended purpose. So that's the approach we've used in the level of service assessment program. So for each of our structures, what we've done is identified what must occur for us to need to do something at that structure. I think that was a little bit windy. I'm not sure if I fully got your.
I can give some additional information quickly.
Okay.
Specifically looking at the plan that we have now, I think it's important to say what we are planning for. And we mentioned in the beginning that we are sizing the pumps to have adaptive capacity, so that in the future, if we see the sea level rise occur in a faster rate than projected, we can add pumps, or if you reach any additional critical capacity, we can add pumps, and we can add additional features in the system that can accommodate those additional flood protection needs. The statute, the state is requiring us to look at two specific curves when we look at our plan. They require us to look at the low and intermediate low and intermediate high NOAA sea level rise projections. So the pump capacity that we are including in the plan now, we are reading that they can provide protection for 20 years of sea level rise by looking at the intermediate high curve, and 40 years of sea level rise if we're looking at the intermediate low. So we are between 20 and 40 years with the proposed initial pump capacity that we included in the plan. Hardening the gate and the structure is a little bit different on the on what we are thinking about life expectancy. It varies case by case. But looking at the sea level rise scenarios, we are talking about addressing needs for the next 20 to 40 years.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you both. I appreciate that. Mr. Bergeron.
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to thank our staff. A great presentation, and the way you presented it, it's very easy to follow. I did have the same question as Jackie and Ben, but you've already answered that. But in coordination between all of the structures that we're going to modify and raise, and a lot of these structures have been operating based upon gravity, and now we're going to be going to pumps because of the sea rise. And so the question I have is, how do we, in between all of these structures, is it the local government that will be evaluating requirements on seawalls in order that we can keep inflows coming in from sea rise in between our structures? Are we coordinating with the counties and local government to tie into what we're designing here, is my question.
Yvette, can you please go back 2 or 3 slides when we have the Army Corps picture? I think it's going to help us to answer this question. one more, I think, one more. So what I like about this slide, and I didn't spend too much time explaining it, is because we understand we have several things that are going to be happening and being planned by different agencies at the same time. So coming from the right to the left, you see there the initial barrier, island protection, some beach and dune restoration types of projects. We look at then natural-based solutions that those counties and the Army Corps are planning, including living shorelines, vegetated feature, oyster, coral reefs. Coming a little bit further to the left, we see shoreline stabilization, and this also includes all those seawalls that you're talking about. And of course, it comes along with our levee and flood wall projects. So just to give you an example that we have different agencies, different types of projects that needed to be coordinated. And what we are focusing here, a little bit, of course, our role is reservoirs, canal, drainage improvements. We do a lot of what we also see here on treating and stormwater treatment area. This is also part of the solution. We are moving water, and we want to make sure we're going to be moving the right water quality. And then we also have the county itself doing the work. Not that they are not involved in everything else, but of course they have those specific measures that are pertaining to the county role, which is elevating building, acquiring property, relocating, and really preparing for those flood warning and evacuation. So I think what we have here is a sequence of type of projects, and it's our role to really be coordinating with those agencies, with those water managers, resiliency planners, to understand how those projects work together, how they complement each other, and how we can really plan for those solutions. And the format that we adopt here for our FPLOS phase 2 is really to be able to capture those projects that are going to be in addition to the projects that we focus traditionally on, canal enhancements and pumps and drainage improvements. So we are really trying to see what else can we bring, what other types of projects do we need to look at, what else is being planned in the region so that we can provide those integrated solutions. I can give one quick example, and I had a conversation earlier this morning when we were visiting our coastal structure, S29, and then we were discussing, okay, how high do we want to elevate this gate? Do we want to protect the structure against the storm surge? And we were clarifying that per design, those structures were not meant to provide any protection against storm surge. And we were thinking, okay, but now that we're going to be reformulating them, how high do we want to elevate? Do we really want to try to provide additional storm surge? And we, by some initial studies that we did, we see that maybe, yes, we can elevate a little bit more and we can provide additional storm surge protection. But at the same time, we know there are options being assessed by the Army Corps that look at storm surge gates a little bit downstream of the coastal structure that might address this first, I would say, layer of storm surge protection. Then we don't need to really elevate our structure that much. So that's really the balance, and that's the need that we need to be constantly working with those other agencies to understand what projects they're planning and how those projects relate to our projects. So hopefully we'll have those storm surge gates being advanced as well downstream of the coastal structure, so we can have a combined protection there by having the structure hardened and having the storm surge gate that would also bring the storm surge protection.
And Mr. Bergeron, if you would let me just add one more thing to that. So specific to your question, yes, we are doing that coordination. As Dr. Moran mentioned, a critical aspect of our phase 2 and mitigation planning and adaptation studies are this engagement with the partners and stakeholders. So Dr. Zhao on my staff is leading a project right now on the C8 and C9 basin, and she and her team have had a workshop, public workshop, attended by many people from local government to 98 districts, municipalities within the region, and they've continued to have follow-up calls to gather projects and understand the interaction between projects planned by local government and 298 districts and the kind of projects that we're looking at. So specific to your question, yes, we're integrating, we're talking to different people. Dr. Moran mentioned the Corps of Engineers, but we're talking to everybody who has potential to affect flood protection within the basin we're studying. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Mr. Bergeron, and thank you all for your questions and for those great answers. At this time, we're going to go to public comment. Public comments are going to be limited to 3 minutes. We're still going to try and wrap up by 1 o'clock. Yvette, are there any hands raised?
Yes, Chairman, we have Betty Argue, followed by Rhonda Roth.
Hi, this is Betty Argue. I am the president of the Indian Trail Improvement District Board. We're a Chapter 298 district, and I just want to thank you for the great presentation and as well for the support for the Corbett levy. That's all I have.
Thank you. Rhonda Roth. Ms. Roth.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry about that. I just have a question. And I really appreciate all the work that's going into this. It's high time. I think I might have missed the number. The question was asked before about what are we planning for? How many feet of sea level rise during what period of time are we planning?
So we are looking at about 50 years. And when I mentioned the 20 to 40 years, I'm referring to the 2070 time. Looking at 50 years. So by 2070, looking at 40 inches of sea level rise in the intermediate high curve and 17 inches of sea level rise in the intermediate low curve.
40 and 17, is that what you said?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Brad Conwell. Brad Cornell.
Yes, here I am. This is Brad Cornell with Audubon Western Everglades. I just thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. I appreciate this really detailed presentation, lots of great information, and we're looking forward to coordinating on this. One question I have, though, as I look at this resiliency and adaptation planning process, I don't see a lot of discussion about drought resiliency, which is also part of some of the climate change impacts that are expected and we're already seeing in the dry seasons. And part of that, of course, is the storage capacity and looking for opportunities to store water and water quality elements. So I just wanted to put that out there as a question, and if this is not being incorporated as a comprehensive adaptation strategy, we need to be thinking about the dry season drought vulnerability as well. Thanks.
Mr. Cornell, followed by Elizabeth Ragamando.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your time and this amazing presentation. I am Elizabeth Accomando. I'm a resident in Western Loxahatchee, out in what used to be farmland. I'm supportive of the project. We have major issues out in our area with flooding and our high water table. It's varying. There have been times when we've been under 5 feet of water. The Corbett project especially is very important. As you guys know, they're in the acreage Loxahatchee area after Isaac, and it really to be hardened and reinforced to protect the 17,000 landowners in our area, and of course then those far south as well. So I just wanted to say again, I'm in support of the project, and whatever you guys can do to preserve our way of life. I'm very happy that developers, we had a lot of development in our area. A lot of the farmland is bought out, and cities are being built, and that's, you know, obviously more issues. So thank you again for your time and for listening.
Thank you. And Mr. Cornell, staff will follow up with you. Next is Mr. Bob Morgan.
Hello, good afternoon. I'd like to thank you for the presentation. It was very informative.
Mr. Morgan?
Hello, can you hear me? I'm unmuted.
I can hear you, sir.
Okay. I'm not sure who's not able to. This is Bob Morgan. I'm the president of Acreage Landowners Association, and I'd like to thank you for the presentation. It was very informative, and I just wanted to say, give us our support for the Corbett Levee project. We definitely need some help out here in some of our western areas of our community that, like as Elizabeth was mentioning, that ends up underwater after some serious storms. But again, I'd like to thank you for the presentation and the time to speak.
Thank you. Chairman, I have no other hands raised.
Well, thanks very much, Yvette. And thank you for your comments, everyone. And thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. We're going to make a recording of today's meeting available on the district's website. And with that, it's 12:58 and we are adjourned.